If you've watched all the MCU movies in chronological and in release order, you might be a big fan. If you've considered naming children after secondary characters, you might be a huge fan. And if you're watching this video, well, you get the idea. That's why we've got a bunch of fun details that you might have missed in the MCU. So let's get started.
We're good.
Never one to let a moment for Easter eggs slip by, the folks behind Thor decided to have a little fun when Thor gets a driver's license from New York in the original Thor movie. A screenshot of the license reveals a few fun things. The first is that even certified handsome person Chris Hemsworth can look a little goofy in his license photo. The second is that the alias he went by was Donald Blake.
His name is Donald Blake?
Dr. Donald Blake.
This wasn't a random choice. In the original comics, Thor's spirit was hosted by an actual human. That human's name? Benedict Cumberbatch. Only kidding, that would be super weird. It was Donald Blake. The license also has the state motto for New York, Excelsior. Now, Stan Lee fans, and who among us is not a Stan Lee fan, will know that Excelsior was Stan's personal motto. It means ever upward. So you wouldn't be crazy to assume that the post-production department on Thor decided to make that the New York state motto for the movie. But you'd be wrong. Excelsior actually is the state motto of New York. It's a fun and cool coincidence. Or maybe Stan Lee saw it on a New York driver's license at one point early in his life and decided it would make a great personal motto. In Captain America: Civil War, there's a quick shot where you can see the chest plate of War Machine's suit. On it are about 22 or so heads that look an awful lot like the Ultron machines he and the gang fought in Age of Ultron. Fans have been quick to point out that as a fighter pilot, he'd be following tradition by putting an emblem on his suit for each enemy he shot down. And the body count sorta makes sense if you think back to the Battle of Sokovia. War Machine wasn't there from the get-go, so he wouldn't have nearly as high a count as the other Avengers. He was also on somewhat of an assignment to protect the perimeter, so he probably would have encountered fewer of the machines from that. Of course, since this is the internet, there are folks online who think this would be an embarrassingly low tally for a battle like this. In response, some other folks have pointed out that it's possible each of the heads on his chest plate represents multiples of kills. Either way, we can agree that he showed up in the nick of time and helped win the battle, even if he killed fewer Ultron machines than a guy with a bow and arrow. Boom. In Spider-Man: Homecoming, there's a shot of Spidey where you briefly see a building in the background with the name Bagley written on it in graffiti. It might seem like a random name, but it actually has significance in the Spider-Man world. It's a nod to comic book artist Mark Bagley, who worked on both Spider-Man and Ultimate Spider-Man. Nice to see the MCU folks not only respect and value the originators of these characters, but they give them a shout out in the movies. There's a fun little detail in Ant-Man when we see an aerial shot of the Avengers compound. If you look closely, you'll notice that in the grass outside the main building is a circular-looking pattern. And while you might think that was the groundskeeping crew having a few too many the night before and carving some art into the grass, it was actually a fun continuity choice from a previous movie. In Age of Ultron, Thor lands with a big old godlike thud in the grass at the compound. It leaves a pretty distinctive mark up on the grass.
That man has no regard for lawn maintenance.
And in Ant-Man, they absolutely could have left that mark out of this quick aerial shot. No one would have noticed it was missing, most likely, or if they had, people might have assumed it had been fixed up by the crew at the compound. But MCU doesn't roll like that, do they? They made sure to digitally add in the markings Thor created in Age of Ultron. This ensured the continuity between the two movies and left us wondering what other marks Thor has made all over the galaxy with his impressive and intense landings.
I have no choice.
In Spider-Man: Homecoming, there's a shot of a poster on the wall of Peter Parker's classroom, and since it's a physics class, the poster is science-focused. It lists names and photos of a bunch of famous scientists. On it are names you'd expect, like Enrico Fermi, Galileo, and Albert Einstein. But the most current name on the list is none other than Bruce Banner. It comes complete with a pic of Mark Ruffalo looking his most Bruce Bannery, aka not a lick of green on him. It's a fun wink to our favorite scientist turned green guy turned scientist green guy hybrid. If you're a fan of The Daily Show, then you probably love the comedic stylings of South African comic Trevor Noah. So you'll be happy to know our man Trevor actually had a small cameo in Black Panther. He plays a role called Griot, which is actually the name for an AI that helps flight navigation in the battle scene at the end. Griot was tech that was invented by the Shuris, and it aided Everett Ross fly that virtual plane. As if it wasn't cool enough to pilot a virtual fighter jet, you get to have Trevor Noah's voice leading you through it. No wonder things worked out well in that last battle. In an interview with Vanity Fair about the role, Noah pointed out that people in the movie speak Xhosa, a language unique to South Africa. Since he grew up there, he speaks it. He said he was particularly proud to be a part of Black Panther because of their authentic Xhosa speakers. In fact, he told Vanity Fair that people in South Africa love the film as a whole because it has a lot of authenticity when it comes to small details of African culture and heritage. So I guess the bigger question is, should someone from Black Panther be the upcoming host of The Daily Show? I vote for Michael B. Jordan, because that guy can do pretty much anything, am I right? In Thor Ragnarok, we all fell in love with the character of the Grand Master. I mean, for starters, he did a killer impression of Jeff Goldblum, so right away that's very cool. And he also was a serious vibe. Have you ever seen someone literally profiteering from prisoners ripping each other apart who is also the chillest dude? It was bizarre, lovable, and hilarious. And as Thor learns his fate, aka he'll have to fight his friend from work, Hulk, we also see that the Grandmaster has huge busts on the exterior of his palace. He claims Hulk is his all-time favorite champion, which explains why a giant bust of Hulk's head is in the process of being built, even while he's still alive and kicking in the arena. But in the shot of the Grandmaster's favorites, we see some interesting heads from his previous captors. One of them is a Corbinite head, which Thor fans will recognize as aliens from his neck of the woods. The theory is that this head is likely Beta Ray Bill, a Corbinite who actually had control of Mjolnir for a bit when Thor was not on active duty. Bill ended up getting a hammer of his own from Odin and was an ally of Thor and his people after that. The other heads outside the Grandmaster Stadium are the mighty Bi-Beast, an android who faces off against Hulk at one point, as well as Man-Thing, a swamp monster, and finally there's Ares, the god of war. No big deal. In the Avengers, New York was visited from above by a lovely little alien gang known as the Chitauris, but instead of politely knocking, they decided to descend with Loki in quite the aggressive manner. Fortunately, the Avengers gang was around to save the day as per usual. But there's a nice little wink to this win that happens in Guardians of the Galaxy. In the scene where the gang visits the giant headquarters of the Collector, we get to see an assortment of items that the Collector has amassed over the years. At one point, we see Rocket walk by a glass case that's holding a dead Chitauri soldier. It's a nice wink to the fact that the Avengers totally beat those jerks into submission. Another example of the tiniest continuity details that the Marvel folks included is in the Avengers. There's a scene where Tony Stark and Loki go toe-to-toe, and in the frame is a shot of Tony's bar. And while it's mostly brown liquors and decanters, there's also one photo. An eagle-eyed Redditor noticed that it's actually a photo of Tony and Pepper that was taken in Iron Man 2. We see them having their picture taken at a party, and that same photo then adorns Tony's bar in the Avengers. Now that's attention to detail. It also makes me feel warm and fuzzy that Tony cares that much for Pepper, but that's probably something I need to deal with in therapy, so we'll leave it there. Remember when you were in the theaters watching Endgame and Captain America caught Mjolnir and then used it to smash Thanos? It was probably the most spine-tingling moment in your movie-going life, right? I got hit in the head with popcorn because the guy behind me screamed and jumped out of his seat so fast. Totally worth it though. It was a magical moment. Of course, for fans of the comics, it wasn't a major surprise. It's been established over a variety of comics that Cap has the old Mjolnir mojo. But in the MCU, seeing him wield it in Endgame was the first time we all experienced that on film, sort of. You might remember that when Captain America lifts Mjolnir, Thor has an aha moment saying, "I knew it." This is a reference to the time in Age of Ultron when we saw Captain America almost lift Mjolnir from the table. When asked about this moment, the Russo brothers, who directed the film, admitted that they had already made the decision that Cap had the skills to lift Mjolnir back then. They crafted that moment so that Cap gives us the most subtle of hints that he can do it, but that he decides not to. This is because he's trying not to show Thor up. He's a humble dude, what can I say? And Thor is, well, a god with an easily bruised ego. So Cap does the polite thing and pretends he can't actually lift Mjolnir. That's class, y'all. One fun special effect that we've seen in a few of the MCU movies has been making actors look younger. In Captain America: Civil War, we see an aged-down Robert Downey Jr. in a scene with his parents. Speaking of a young Downey Jr., did you ever see Back to School? A classic, highly recommend. Anyway, the effects are pretty amazing at this point, so he looks pretty legit. The same thing happens with Kurt Russell in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. So when it came to de-aging Lawrence Fishburne's character in Ant-Man and the Wasp, you'd think they would have just used that same special effect and give us a glimpse of a young Lawrence, which we actually got in a way. There's a flashback scene where we get the original story of how Ava Starr is turned into Ghost. So naturally, we needed to see a young Bill Foster in that scene. But instead of using special effects, they used a little something called progeny. They cast Lawrence Fishburne's actual son, Langston. Not only did it probably save them some money in post-production, it was a cool wink to the talent of the Fishburne family. Langston is more than just a facial stand-in for his dad too. He's an actor and a ballet dancer. Plus, he's now part of the MCU. At the end of Endgame, Morgan and Happy share a lovely and poignant moment. It's just after Tony Stark's funeral, which is obviously an incredibly sad time. But Morgan lets Happy know she'd like to have a cheeseburger. Happy smiles a little more than you'd expect.
You know, your dad liked cheeseburgers.
That's because he knows full well that Tony loved cheeseburgers too, and it created a bit of cool symmetry in the MCU series of movies released up until that point. That's because in the very first one, when Tony escapes captivity in Iron Man and gets back to the US, he declares the only thing he wants is a cheeseburger.
I want an American cheeseburger.
And now, all those movies later, Tony's gone, but his daughter is keeping his legacy alive in more ways than one. I'm not crying, you're crying. If you're older than, say, 40, you might remember seeing the movie Flash Gordon. Okay, maybe it's closer to over 50, but hey, MCU fans come in all ages, so I'm sure there are plenty of you watching this who were alive during the Carter administration. And even if you're a young buck, you might have seen this campy classic or read Flash Gordon comics. Well, clearly Tony Stark is familiar with the muscular hero because he makes a reference to him in Avengers Infinity War. Tony, as you might have realized, has something of a large ego. Sound familiar? Cool. Anyway, one of his favorite pastimes is to take digs at everyone in his general vicinity. So when he begins hanging out with another character with a strong to quite strong ego, Peter Quill, it was no surprise that Tony tried to take him down a peg or two. At one point, he refers to Quill as Flash Gordon.
Flash Gordon, by the way, that's a compliment.
And while some people might have just laughed this off as a gag for baby boomers and Gen Xers, there was actually something more involved going on. It was a nod to the fact that Peter Quill and Flash Gordon have eerily similar stories. They both started on Earth, get sent off into space at one point, and turn into intergalactic heroes. They both fight the good fight against a major alien baddie, and both are generally quite handsome. But that's more about casting than anything else, and we're here for it.
I'm half human, so that 50% of me that's stupid, that's 100% you.
Sometimes the coolest details in the MCU are simply when they nail continuity from movie to movie. It really shows how much effort goes into crafting these movies and making sure they all make sense within the MCU, and that there are through lines from movie to movie, story to story. A fun example of this is in Thor: The Dark World. There's a shot of the Bifrost Bridge where you can clearly see a crack running across it diagonally. This is due to the fact that in the previous Thor movie, the original Thor, the Bifrost was broken off. Clearly this is meant to show that the people of Asgard got together and repaired the bridge so it could function properly again. It's not a huge detail, and Marvel probably would have been forgiven if they just showed the bridge and didn't have it looking repaired, but it's pretty cool they included the crack to remind us of what happened. And maybe, just maybe, to show we can all be repaired if we work together. Too far? I don't know. The folks on the creative side at the MCU aren't immune to mistakes. But what's cool is they're often down to do what they can to fix them. A great example of this comes in Thor Ragnarok, when Hela is in Odin's vault. She's there to get the eternal flame, but before she gets to it, she walks over to the Infinity Gauntlet and knocks it to the floor. Why? Because she says it's actually a fake. This move doesn't do much in terms of that particular scene, but it's actually an important one in terms of the overall MCU. It's an attempt by the MCU creatives to right a subtle wrong that happened in the original Thor movie. That's when we first got a glimpse of the gauntlet and all of its splendor. Sort of. In Thor, the glove is clearly right-handed. This was all fine and dandy until the post-credits scene in Age of Ultron. In that scene, Thanos puts on the glove and whoops, it goes on his left hand. So unless Thanos was born with two right hands, it means the real gauntlet is for a lefty. Once some fans noticed this discrepancy and pointed it out online, the MCU folks had to figure out a solution. So they did a little classic retconning, having Hela proclaim the original right-handed version as a fake. Boom, problem solved. Hopefully this video has given you an even greater appreciation of the incredible levels of detail and fun that go into the MCU. And now, on to Phase 5.